Well, thank you very much for joining me in this video. As you know, these content in these videos comes from material that comes across my desk or calls I receive from my agents, some situations that crop up. And in the last couple of weeks, on 2 or 3 occasions, I've agents come to me asking questions about self-represented parties. They've been approached by individuals who show an interest in one of their listings, and they say, I'm really interested in looking at it and perhaps putting in an offer, but I want to be self-represented. When I hear that, I say, well, did you ask them why they want to be self-represented? In these cases, yes, they did. And what was the answer? Well, they want to save the commission. And of course, that makes sense. That's why they would be motivated to do that. Why would they want to try and figure out how to fill out a form on their own or hire a lawyer to do it when they could get a realtor to do it, unless it's going to save them money? So that's really the root of their motivation. I want to talk to you for a second about this whole issue of saving the commission. Under Tressa, Rico came along and said, when you fill out a listing, you've got to be specific about what's happening to the listing commission, the portion that's kept by the listing office, and more importantly, the portion that's being offered to the cooperating brokerage. And you have to spell out what that money is going to be going to. And they said each scenario, and they included the scenario of a self-represented party. Now, they hinted that that money should be reverting back to the seller. They didn't say that, but they kind of implied that. You remember when we put out a Schedule C about how the commission was going to be broken down? I spelled out in that Schedule C that the commission that was earmarked for the cooperating broker, when it's a case of a self-represented party, would be retained to the listing brokerage. This is what we've got in the clause. The amount designated as payable to the cooperating brokerage shall be such and such a percent of the sale price of the property or so much money and shall be retained by the listing brokerage. Now, there's 2 really good reasons for that. The first reason is that, you remember when you're in competition, you have 2 or 3 or 4 offers in competition, and somebody, maybe somebody cuts the commission. Sometimes an agent will say, well, I'm doing it for, say, 4%, but if I double-end it, I'll do it for 3%. Always tell them to say, however, in the event we're involved in multiple offers coming in, this reduction of commission shall not apply. Because otherwise you have to tell all the other agents who are bringing in offers, well, I'm cutting my cooperating brokerage portion of the commission by 1%. And you got to give them the opportunity to do the same thing. So it's a level playing field. That's Rico's interpretation of it. So if you've got a self-represented party and the money is going to be retained that normally would go to the cooperating brokerage, retained by the seller. Let's say it's a gross commission of 4%. So if it's a self-represented party, the seller's keeping 2 and paying out 2. So he's got 3 or 4 competing offers. All of the other ones are at 4%, and the self-represented party is at 2%. So if it's a $500,000 property, the seller is $10,000 better off if they come in at the same price, taking the self-represented party's offer. Why would you want to do that? You don't want to do that. And you don't want to get into telling all the other agents, look, there's going to be no commission on the selling end because it's self-represented party. Keep the commission. But there's another stronger reason, and that's you're going to earn it. The idea is that, well, I'm representing the seller, I'm not representing the buyer, so I'm only doing half the work and only should get half the money. But in actual fact, you're doing a lot more work, and you need to keep this in mind, and you need to explain it to your seller in justification of why you're going to be retaining that commission yourself. And first of all, let me say, you need to be a designated representative, not a brokerage representation. It's very, very important. And I don't want to get sidetracked here, but if you're a brokerage representation, that means anybody in your office can show your listing to a self-represented party because they're representing the interests of the seller and he is their client. You go way back years ago to sub-agency. What a disastrous mess that was, where you could be, for example, working with a buyer and showing them all kinds of property and eventually showing them a property that's listed, for example, by LePage. And technically they're saying you owe your obligation to the seller under sub-agency, not under the buyer that you're working with. Well, that was ludicrous. But that's what you get into here. Somebody else in your office is working with a self-represented party, not working for them, but working with them. They show the property, and the person says, would you help me draft the offer? And it's going to be very easy for them to step over the line and all of a sudden create that person as being a client. And yet you're going to be involved in the middle of this because you have the listing. So you're a lot better off if you're designated representative, then you're the only person that can show the property. If you don't show the property, that self-represented individual is not going to see it unless he sees it through an open house or online. All right, you might have to draft the offer. Oh, and you say, well, you can't. Well, you can. You got to be extremely careful. But if the property's been on the market for 6 months, been no offers, and a self-represented party comes along and says, I'd like to buy it, I saw it through an open house, would you mind writing up the offer? I'll tell you what I want in it. Well, as long as he's dictating and you're just the scribe, yeah, you can do it. And you'd say, well, I'd rather not, but you don't want to lose the potential of a sale for your seller, and so you are going to do it. But it's so easy to cross over the line. You say, how much you want to put as a deposit? And the guy says, well, what would you suggest? Well, you can't suggest. Otherwise, remember, as soon as they rely on you or you're providing advice, you've created agency. So it's a very much of a minefield doing this. It can be done, but it's a slippery slope. You got to be very, very careful. And then as you're presenting this or preparing this offer, the question comes up, do they have a house to sell? Well, yes, they do have a house to sell. Do you need to sell a house in order to buy the other house? You can ask that question because these are information pieces that you need to give your seller, and you'd want to know these things. But you got to find out what information you can to represent your seller without crossing over the line and answering questions that the buyer. You can say, have you been pre-qualified? And you say, what do you mean by pre-qualified? Now you're going to explain that. Well, you can't explain that. And he says, well, would you suggest that? Well, of course, but you can't say that. You got to be very, very careful. But then you get into, even if he goes to his lawyer and gets the offer drafted, well, then it's going to be a mess, you know. They're not going to look after the best interest of the seller at all. For example, they may have a sale of property without an escape clause. All these things you have to sit down and go over with a fine-tooth comb with your seller and make sure his interests are protected. You draft up a sign back, you give it to the self-represented party, and who's going to explain it to him? You can't. You got to be very, very careful. All right, so you want to qualify. You got to qualify. You're sitting down with your seller going over this offer that was brought into you by a lawyer, and the seller says, well, they got a house to sell. Is it on the market? I don't know. Is it priced properly? I don't know. Can they buy it if they don't sell their house? I don't know. What kind of a job do they have? Haven't a clue. How much money do they have set aside? I don't know. I mean, you can't do that. When there's somebody representing the buyer, you're going to ask all these questions to the agent because it's important for the seller to know that so he can move forward. You're going to have to somehow find those answers out without representing the buyer, the self-represented party. And then it's conditional on home inspection. Who do you think is going to accompany the buyer in the home inspection? Not his agent. He doesn't have one. You could technically have the seller home with the seller's consent, but I don't think you want that with the buyer and seller there together. You're going to be the guy that's going to be tying up 3 hours of your time because there's not an agent representing the buyer. And then what about subsequent walkthroughs? We had one that was a self-represented party. They brought in an offer, and in the offer, they requested 9 subsequent walkthroughs. Well, that got changed on signback, but that's the sort of thing that they wanted. Well, when the offer came together, the buyer, self-represented party, said to the agent, when can I pick up the key? They just figured they were going to get a key now, wander through the house at their leisure and have a look. It doesn't work that way. It falls on the shoulders of the listing agent. You're the person who's going to have to do that. And what about notices of fulfillment of conditions and waivers and all this kind of stuff? You got to do all those kind of things. So you've got a ton of work. You've got more work than if the buyer was actually represented, because then you could rely on his agent. You could pick up the phone and say, tell me a little bit about this buyer. Where does he work? What kind of money does he earn? Has he been qualified? Does he have a house to sell? You can ask all these questions. Well, now you can ask some of the same questions, but you got to be very careful with subsequent questions that he asks you in return, that you don't cross over the line. And that's the other thing. You got to be very, very careful with the dangers that are inherent when you've got a self-represented party. You find out this information, you ask some questions, but you got to be careful that they're not relying on you. So they want to make it sale of property, and you say, what about an escape clause? Do you say that? They're going to say, what's an escape clause? You can't explain that to them. So you write it down, or you accept the offer, and then you're going to have to change it all with your seller. You got to be very, very careful that you're not encompassing inadvertently agency issues. And so the best solution is to just avoid it altogether. And you can. Bear in mind that if you're the designated representative, the only person that can show that property to the self-represented party is you. And you can sit down with the seller and say, listen, here's all the pitfalls, here's all the problems, and are you okay with us just flat out not working with a self-represented party? And if the seller says yes, then you can do that. But again, the property's been on the market for 6 months, there's been no offers, you get a call from somebody, they say, I saw the property at an open house, I want to buy it, but I want to be a self-represented party. Do you really want to tell the guy to get lost? No, you want to probably go through that. First thing you're going to do is go through the information guide with Rico and try and explain the options and so on. Tell him there's no financial advantage and try and swing him over to being a represented party. But if he's not, you may want to walk that walk to get the deal together. But understand, you need to be a designated representative. You need to retain the selling portion of the cooperating brokers portion of the commission, and you need to be very, very careful. Thank you for investing your time. I'll talk to you again next week.